safe and dealing with these stressing times in the best way. Second, of course, I would like to thank so much the kind invitation to share the floor with a fantastic set of speakers, and congratulate the FFWD for this fantastic project and implemented in the record time during this unforgettable period. Finally, as previously marked, please take the following insights as my personal views. Nevertheless, my absolute pleasure to work, especially in periods like this, at the Office for Economic Policy and International Relations of the Portuguese Ministry of Finance. The purpose of this section is to point out how strategic foresight can improve its effectiveness in the policy-making process, having in mind that, sorry, I would like to make the presentation mode. I was saying that the purpose of this section is to point out how strategic foresight can improve its effectiveness in the policy-making process, having in mind what we think we know about how pandemics will puzzle future tragedies. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have heard a lot about foresight. Given the multiple studies that mention this kind of disruption, albeit as a wild card. The high volume of news, remembering Bill Gates' conversation back in 2015, when he pointed out why this might happen in absence of a system at all, triggered the general public interest and perception about the importance of critical subsystems as, of course, public health and health security, and the perception of preparedness. And that's why I think this will be an opportunity to strategic foresight can be more effective, can have more impact in policy making process, regardless the greatest constraints that is the different times of this decision making and the horizon time, the long term time usually we work on, and how time of course has changed during this period, but later on we come back to this. Above all, and even between us as a community shaped with a mindset shaped to address the future and to identify alternative futures, most of us never really imagined to live it. So let's start. Our rule is repeating that uncertainty is our raw material. Some of the drivers of change that we have been working on, of course, will be accelerated by the pandemic, while others will curb and certain new ones will emerge. So what we think we know about how pandemics will puzzle time frame. Self-isolations and supply chains with disruption are characteristics of a time of fear. Well, fear about the present, about how to stop the disease, and fear about the speed and the scale of its spread, the severity of the cases, the million cases we already had, and the day after, as the societal and economic disruption will be dramatic. Of course, that those impacts are different, and countries face different scenarios requiring a tailored response depending on whether countries have no cases or have some sporadic cases, can have a cluster of cases and a community transmission. During this morning, already had been said, there's a kind of democratization of jobs, and this pandemic, addressed as global, has hidden the Western hemisphere and the more powerful blocs, namely the European Union and the United States. So the speed and the damage of this pandemic created a climate of fear. Also due to the perception that the effects will be lasting beyond its duration. The speed up of the research regarding vaccines and effective antivirals will drive us to the end of the next year or the early 2022. So the mission and the time is of the urgency. So the mission is to stop the spread and restoring global health. So time is to act, to mitigate the losses, but when at what cost? People expect social protection. People expect to avoid the absolute economic and social collapse, especially since the reasonable set of countries, as Portugal, for instance, here in Europe, has been navigating through a crisis since during the last decade, and this will be the first year we always expected the stabilization of public finance and some effective recovery of household incomes. So people in this time expect social protection as incorporated how health systems are fragile and fear the effects of these self-isolation. And this, of course, will impact the upon values. Values are changing with growing skeptical attitudes towards capitalism, solidarity, a lack of solidarity within integrated spaces, as we have been seeing here at the European Union, and hope on governments and how they must act as savior of last resort. Governments are in time of urgency. We are all reviewing programs and macroeconomic scenarios, but the people want to feel safe, to back to normal, to their jobs, to their schools, to their lives. They are freezing, dealing with the self-isolation, dealing with fears, but they want back on track of time. Most of us had lost the perception of time. For decision makers, time is for action, as I said, is becoming shorter. The mission is to return to a business as usual, and to mix up and shift priorities in order to recover the normalization of economic activity and social activity too. But the question is that, and particularly relevant for us, is that's not a near back to basics. There will be a transition from before COVID world to an after COVID, and the reconstruction will depend upon what part of the pre-COVID-19 world as a social, ideologic, and political system has been really destroyed, and how this destruction was carried out. So plenty of questions, of course, that's our job. It will depend by the amount of damages and sheer destruction imposed by the pandemic, and by how actors shall be at the end of the pandemic, whatever it will be in 6 months, a year, regardless, a bounce back, next waves of stress, eventually less intense. So this is the time to respond. This is the time of pandemics, the length of time during which the pandemic will last, as well as the timing and duration of the measures taken does really matter. So key critical factors to overcome this time of urgency, of course, will be the vaccines and antiviral treatment. According to recent data of UNESCO released last week, 166 countries have implemented countrywide school and university closures. More than 1.5 billion children and teens are currently out of school or university, representing 87% of the world enrolled school and university student population. Besides that, more than 60 million teachers are no longer in the classroom. As for the older persons that configure the most vulnerable and targeted group for the disease. The older are not just struggling with these greater health risks, but they are also likely to be less capable of supporting themselves in the isolation context. The homeless people, because they may be unable to safely get a shelter, are of course highly exposed to the danger of the virus. Persons with disabilities could be left out without vital support and advocacy in minimal conditions due to social distance. The persons in prisons here in Portugal is ongoing a debate about the release of 1,200 prisoners because of prevention measures to stop the spread of the disease at the community. The migrant detention centers, the mental health institutions, the mental health is quite problematic. We all know that the mental illness are growing, have grown during the last years, and of course that during this period such phenomena, namely among the youngest, are apparent, of course. The most vulnerable, and this includes women too, here in Portugal, of course, that some of the measures are to reinforce the shelters and the capacity to deal with growth on the domestic violence in the context of isolation. So, as for climate change and climate action, I think that the way this period and the social evaluation and the social valorization of science and scientists is remarkable. We as foresighters have also an opportunity to rethink the way some of the drivers of change can work from here, namely the questions regarding aging and climate change, and of course health security. There's a false sense of the positive effect of this lockdown on the climate change indicators. We all, most of us for sure, all have seen.
Hello, Fatima. Looks like we lost your audio.
These are temporary, and worse than that, climate action should be associated to a transformative agenda, a different way of economic organization and goals. Associate climate change or climate improvement to a social distance and to those kind of social costs, to job losses, to house arrest is absolutely counterpartisan. So yesterday a colleague of mine from the Pacific said that their country doesn't have already any funds to address this pandemic, and yet the typhoon seasons is yet to come. So how to address also the natural disasters that vulnerable countries must do every year, and most of us are concerned with the regular hand washing as a prevention measures, but supply disruptions and inadequate access to clean water hinder access to clean hand washing facilities. So the spread of the pandemic will be dramatic, absolutely dramatic in Africa. But as history has taught us, turbulence opens doors to creativity. So if this is the time to act, this is what people expect. This is why they see governments as the savior of last resort, and also expect answers, effective responses. In the next moment, when the spread is controlled, it's time to rethink. Time to rethink on how the drivers of change have as effective change. In the recent years, we have been working with trends and tensions such as the growth of populism and extreme right, far right movements on both sides of the Atlantic, the digitalization and also the digital divide, the pressure on individual freedoms, how the AE and the reconfiguration of the economic organization and labor markets, the inequalities, the fragmentation, climate change conflicts over natural resources. So the time has shrinked. The science has a shot has a better reputation from a social perception point of view, is relevant. The scope and the sense of cooperation at the global scale is absolutely wonderful, and so when in policy making, the priorities must be shifted to in a short time. In those time, in times as I refer to urgency, there's some concerns. The discourse is in order to grab a tragedy of the resilient and sustainable society, but there will be severe macroeconomic impacts and a downward on investments. So dropping climate action, delaying visions, will for sure be at the core of our work on rethinking how some megatrends have triggered during these times as digitalization for sure at the top, the way people can accelerate the wave, a new workplace, and how remote work can be so and even more effective, but also can trigger the automation and the automation as substitute of work. Also, as a retreat of some megatrends, some tensions was already ongoing as the retreat on globalization. This lack of solidarity, namely at the European Union, for sure doesn't grant much on the cooperation and the absolute need for cooperation to deal with those kind of global problems, and delaying visions or to have better awareness and preparedness regarding wildcards. I think that can be some interesting drivers for strategic foresight. The linkage between our tools and how we deliver our stories, our narratives regarding strategy are more challenging in order to these kind of horizons dilemmas and deepen populism, deepen nationalism, some kind of multilateralism requiem, and while war in order to reinforce that drop out of climate action, but also to mix up the tensions already in place at the hotspots from the geopolitical point of view. So I think that I'll be brushing up this presentation. I think to rethink strategic foresight or to readjust our way to be useful, to have some impact in the policy making, scanning will be essential for us to create globally and also at a national level an early system early warning system that supports the strategic decision process such as scenario planning. One of the main limitations in our effectiveness on the foresight policy making dialectic is related to the vision and the normative scenarios that tend not to value the risks of great impact, but reduce the probability as wildcards. If we could work better on wildcards integration on explorative scenarios, addressing the preference of policymakers on normative scenarios, identify underline critical subsystems. I think that we can be more useful to implementation or improvement of preparedness of the systems of the lens and deliverables we when we think on the two types of foresight methodologies, so the possible and still emerging futures, I think that horizon scanning can be surgical for some change. When regarding possible futures, Megatrends analysis as focusing on button shifts and the repeating question, what if and so what, mapping the policy implications are absolutely critical for the future. Finally, closing the loop. Futures intelligence usually feed the strategy, but also we must not to neglect the feedback. The current situation opens an opportunity to develop a new social capital. Scenario planning as a social learning process as this advantage, and we should reinforce that. So policy making is becoming increasingly difficult in a period when issues are particularly complex, chaotic, and contradictory. So manage this development that change at a faster pace with a growing scope and escalating impact while dealing with simultaneous events becomes a huge challenge, and we must be able to help on this. And back to the beginning, this kind of initiative and the capacity of changing views is awesome, and that's it. Please, if I will be able to answer to your questions. Thank you very much. Madrid.
And sorry so much. I realized as I was talking for half an hour. So thank you for the resistance to this conversation. As for Ahmed, thank you for your question. He asks what will be the situation of countries with minimal cases. One of the things this situation that I'll think on the unthinkable brought to us is precisely the absence of preparedness and effective response to a severe disease, and the countries with less cases. Of course, since the lockdown turns over and international traveling can back somehow to normal, the difficulties and the problems and are there, the danger. So it will be very important to adapt their health systems to response. Here in Portugal, for instance, comparing to our friends and neighbors of Spain, of course we are much less as population, but we had the opportunity to buy some time. The emergency state that lasts, I think, the problem with time, I think for the third week, and namely with the schools closed, of course, gave some time to government to buy some medical devices and equipment and to deal with the situation. So a few cases, as we have seen in other countries, namely the US, where the administration didn't think the way the things went. Of course, it's problematic. Arturo, thank you. Will it be possible to catalysts return to normal? I think that the one shot that can occur is in the case of a rapid recovery, as the economist said, the V curve. But this climate fear will have some marks, and the length and the intensity of the disease, the pandemics, and the ability of governments to coordinate themselves in order to accelerate the recovery probably comes to that. But the sense of fragility of the whole global system and at the national systems also will probably endure some changes. And above all, there's an opportunity when it comes the time to rethink the rethink process, and where foresighters can have can become more listened by the decision makers. Can drive us to a systemic change and get away from the business as usual that has seeded some disruption function at the organizational mode. Jane, can you say more about futures intelligence to fit strategic approaches? As I said before, thank you for the question. As I said before, I think that usually for future studies are welcomed by the decision makers. We all are praised by the fantastic study. But then there's no implementation or adaptation of namely the wildcards to the system, to the changing system. So I think that reinforce that impact. Namely, as I working at the public administration and trying to give some support to economic policy, namely, and the policy making. There must be also, as I said, the social learning system, more coordination of sectoral approaches, and it's tough. It's very difficult, but we are always struggling to make the decision makers listen to the alternative paths when they always, and because also of the different times of strategy, and we all know the political cycles, and when politicians usually work on a daily basis and lack visions, they usually want normative scenarios. They want a desirable scenarios. They want to tell their potential voters that we are fantastic. We in 2015, 13, we will be better. So this optimistic view is of course welcome to the societies, but there's a lack of trust. And when we are discussing, namely the impacts on the democratic systems, we must underline always the possibility of some future pets can become a reality as we live now. And I think that this kind of disruption, being so different as previous crises and profound crises, as the financial crisis of the last decade, will turn politicians and decision makers more able to attend our work. Okay, Chelsea, how receptive are policymakers to understanding? I think I answered this somehow. We will try to communicate the best ways and emphasize the need of address critical systems, and health system is one of them. But when we told politicians of some of the wild cards, of course, that as they are potential trends with a high impact but low probability, usually they tend to forget, and their optimistic view usually let the things down out and proceed with the business as usual, and changes are more difficult to implement. Andrea, how to identify in which subsystem of scenarios to apply our wildcard? What's the criteria? I think that this is the basic challenge. Besides, of course, the rethinking the drivers of change, is how to we can include more precisely on our narratives the potential consequences of those wildcards. Usually, scenario planning, construction, deliver some scenarios and identify wildcards. It's important, as I put it in one of the slides. Testing. We must deliver must be bold, as Ricardo said this morning. It's one of our tests, and help the decision process upon testing how the wildcards affect the scenarios we built, and how can the scenarios change with them. And I think that will be an important learning for all of us. How will be the impact of the current situation with events? Portugal is interesting, and all over the world, with the arts and media, creative industries, and the creative class has been important to polarize and to identify also some territorial cohesion and international openness. The events and as one of the solid anchors of mobility and freedom of circulation will be somehow huge. Also, this climate fear with generalized people, we have fear to some agglomeration. The mobility is one of the drivers of change that will be severely hit, and somehow if the length of this crisis will be long. As the mobility, the way people interact with each other, of course, when we leave this period of lockdown, we all want to hug our friends and family and get some buzz in a pub. But there will be some, and for instance, for gender goals, if the crisis long lasts, of course that women usually will be called to follow their children and to deal with this school new phase. So I think that I answered that. Finally, Elena, if foresight had been more integrated in policy-making process before, what will be the most important difference in the response from what we actually saw? Well, in terms of response, of course, that probably countries will look at their health systems in another way, namely with further investment. Let me example with our case here. The financial crisis during since 2008 led Portugal to a severe deprivation on the health systems. Lots of our health professionals left the country. They had low salaries, and the problem has been huge. And one of the strategic priorities of the current government for the next few years was precisely a reinforcement of the investment on health system, but not necessarily because of our wildcards, but because the public service has huge investment needs that not the crisis prevent to do it. So the wild card, I told you before the difficulty that this period imposed to climate action, because as we know from the multiple studies, the climate change will be severe, and arises some wild cards. So if governments do not address and do not back on track to an effective investment policy and a global strategy, the climate change, that will be probably the next pandemic, and the next pandemic can be sooner than we thought. I didn't like to end this with a pessimist view, but it will be important to first recover, but to not drop out some of the basic and fundamental critical strategies as to addressing the climate changes and to build up resilient and sustainable societies. Thank you so much. Be safe.